Breaking news has shattered Westminster tonight. In an unprecedented ruling no one saw coming, the United Kingdom's Supreme Court has delivered a political earthquake, forcing Prime Minister Keir Starmer out of office. The courtroom erupted as the verdict was read, declaring that Starmer had violated constitutional boundaries and acted beyond the lawful authority of Parliament. Gasps filled the chamber as reporters outside captured scenes of sheer disbelief. For the first time in modern British history, a sitting Prime Minister has been ordered by the nation's highest court to vacate his position. The crowd outside the Supreme Court began chanting, some in anger, some in celebration, the air thick with tension and confusion. Britain has entered uncharted territory. Within minutes, the story dominated every news channel, every social feed, every conversation. The words "Starmer removed" flashed across the BBC ticker like a thunderclap through the night. Downing Street, once a symbol of control and command, had become a fortress under siege. Police sealed off the area as advisers and aides rushed in and out in a frenzy. Insiders reported panic behind closed doors, staff shredding papers, phones ringing non-stop, cabinet members abandoning meetings. It was chaos at the highest level of government, and the entire nation was watching it unfold live. The court's ruling stemmed from Starmer's controversial decision to bypass Parliament over an emergency economic bill, a move critics called a silent coup. According to legal documents unsealed this morning, Starmer had approved a sweeping executive order granting the Treasury unchecked powers to redirect billions in public funds without a Commons vote. It was meant to be a temporary measure, but the Supreme Court saw it differently. Chief Justice Alexander Reed stated that Starmer's order undermined the democratic process and defied constitutional limits. In short, the Prime Minister had crossed a line no one in his position was ever meant to cross. As the ruling was announced, an eerie silence fell over the Labour benches. Senior ministers stared blankly, some whispering, others visibly trembling. Starmer himself reportedly remained expressionless, leaning forward slightly as the words, "You must resign," echoed through the chamber. Moments later, his security detail quietly ushered him out a side door to avoid cameras and the protesters gathering at the entrance. It was the image of a fallen leader, not defeated at the ballot box, but struck down by the law itself. Outside, the atmosphere turned electric. Supporters of the ruling called it a victory for democracy, claiming the court had saved Britain from authoritarian overreach. But Starmer's allies cried foul, insisting it was a judicial coup and accusing the Supreme Court of overstepping its authority. The divide was instant, deep, and explosive. Protesters clashed on London streets, one side shouting, "Justice has spoken," the other screaming, "Democracy is dead." Parliament Square became a battlefield of banners and voices. The government was collapsing in real time, and no one knew what would happen next. Meanwhile, Buckingham Palace remained silent, though sources close to the royal household confirmed that King Charles had been briefed within the hour. Rumours swirled of an emergency audience at Windsor Castle. Some insiders claimed the king was deeply disturbed by Starmer's actions and the constitutional chaos that followed. Others said he was preparing to issue a royal statement that could determine the fate of the government itself. Across Britain, people waited anxiously for the king's word, as though the nation's balance rested on his next move. In the opposition ranks, Reform UK's Richard Tice wasted no time taking to the airwaves. "This is the beginning of accountability," he declared. Starmer thought he was untouchable, but no one is above the Constitution. His words went viral within minutes, fueling calls for a snap general election. At the same time, Nigel Farage weighed in on GB News, saying bluntly, "This isn't the end of a prime minister, it's the end of a regime." The statement sent shockwaves through Westminster, adding fuel to an already uncontrollable political fire. By nightfall, Downing Street's gates were lined with journalists, police, and chanting crowds. The once commanding voice of Starmer had gone silent. Cabinet ministers reportedly held emergency talks to decide who would assume interim leadership. Rumours of betrayal filled the corridors, whispers that some within Labour had cooperated with the court behind the scenes, quietly feeding evidence to judges to ensure Starmer's downfall. If true, it would mean the Prime Minister was not only defeated by the law, but betrayed by his own party. The chaos extended far beyond politics. Markets plunged overnight, the pound dropping as traders panicked over uncertainty. European leaders issued cautious statements while Washington remained silent. Across the Atlantic, Donald Trump posted a cryptic message on X. When power ignores law, law always wins. The post racked up millions of views, sending British media into a frenzy. The message was clear. The world was watching the UK's political collapse unfold like a live thriller. As dawn approached, the question tearing through the nation was no longer whether Starmer would go. It was who would replace him, and whether Britain's fragile democracy could survive what had just happened. In pubs, living rooms, and studios, people whispered that this could mark the end of Labour's rule, and possibly the beginning of something far darker or far freer. As the dust from the Supreme Court's ruling settled, Britain found itself gripped by something far more sinister than political collapse. A hidden war for power that had been brewing in silence for months. Behind polished smiles and scripted interviews, factions within Labour, the monarchy, and the judiciary had been quietly manoeuvring, each playing its own dangerous game. What looked like justice on the surface was, in truth, the final blow in a silent conflict that had raged unseen throughout the highest corridors of power. Sources close to Parliament whispered that Starmer's downfall did not begin in the courtroom. It began in his own cabinet. For weeks, senior ministers had grown restless, alarmed by his obsession with centralising authority. When Starmer moved to push the Emergency Economic Powers Act without parliamentary approval, it was the last straw. Ministers who once swore loyalty began fearing for their own political survival. One insider leaked that several of them discreetly
Two
consulted
jobs, one at Goldman
constitutional
Sachs and one at the
experts
Bank of
and
England.
judges,
Salary
laying the groundwork for a legal rebellion that would later explode in public. It wasn't just a legal case, it was a political assassination, wrapped in legality. By the time the Supreme Court convened, the machinery of betrayal was already in motion. Former allies like Rachel Reeves and David Lammy reportedly distanced themselves from Starmer's decision-making, crafting statements to protect their reputations if the situation turned toxic. Behind closed doors, messages were exchanged, back-channel meetings were held, and secret assurances were made. Senior civil servants allegedly fed documents to the judiciary detailing Starmer's internal directives, memos proving he had overridden both Treasury protocol and parliamentary consent. Once the judges saw the evidence, there was no going back. Meanwhile, Buckingham Palace maintained its usual air of neutrality, or so it seemed. But palace aides later revealed that King Charles had been quietly briefed for weeks about constitutional irregularities within the Prime Minister's office. His advisers warned him that Starmer's actions risked provoking a direct confrontation between the government and the monarchy, a line no Prime Minister had crossed in the modern era. When the ruling came down, the King's response was said to be cold, deliberate, and absolute. He called an emergency meeting with the Privy Council, insisting that constitutional order must prevail. That phrase, subtle yet loaded, was seen by many as the royal green light that sealed Starmer's fate. The opposition, smelling blood in the water, pounced instantly. Nigel Farage declared that the people have reclaimed sovereignty, while Richard Tice said Reform UK was ready to restore integrity to a government that had lost its moral compass. The Conservative benches, fractured but opportunistic, began pushing for a caretaker administration until new elections could be held. For the first time in decades, all political parties were united by a single emotion: fear. Fear of the vacuum left behind by Labour's collapse. Fear of what could come next. Outside the walls of power, Britain itself was unravelling. Overnight, riots erupted in Manchester, Birmingham, and parts of East London as protesters clashed with police. Labour supporters accused the judiciary of staging a coup. Anti-Labour demonstrators called it the day democracy was saved. Fireworks and flames lit the night in equal measure as the world watched, stunned, while Britain, once the cradle of constitutional order, descended into division unseen since the Brexit fallout. Inside Number 10, chaos turned to despair. Starmer's aides began packing their offices, shredding classified papers and erasing communications. Staffers were ordered to leave personal devices behind. An eerie silence settled over the Prime Minister's office, the hum of computers replaced by the echo of footsteps across marble floors. Even security guards stood uncertain, unsure whether they were still protecting a sitting Prime Minister or guarding a political ghost. In a single night, Starmer went from commanding the nation to being politically homeless. But amid the panic, a new narrative emerged, one far more dangerous than any scandal. Rumours circulated of a secret alliance between senior judges and figures close to the palace. Some claimed the ruling was not justice, but a quiet restoration of royal influence, a reminder that ultimate authority in Britain rested not in Parliament, but in the Crown. Social media exploded with conspiracy theories. Hashtags like hashtag judicial coup and hashtag palace power trended across platforms. For millions of ordinary Britons, trust in the system evaporated overnight. Then came the leaks. A classified memo surfaced on an encrypted journalist network, allegedly written by a senior civil servant in the Cabinet Office. It suggested the Supreme Court's investigation had begun months earlier, possibly triggered by five intelligence briefings, warning that Starmer's policies threatened constitutional balance. If true, it meant Britain's own security agencies played a role in the Prime Minister's downfall. The revelation sent Westminster into paralysis. How deep did this go? Who was really pulling the strings? As reporters pressed for answers, no one in power spoke. The Supreme Court refused to comment. Downing Street issued no statement. Buckingham Palace released only 6 words: "The King respects judicial independence completely." Yet those words carried an undertone, less like neutrality and more like finality. It felt as though the monarchy was quietly reclaiming its place in the national hierarchy, reminding Britain that while governments may rise and fall, the crown endures. As the night deepened, an unmarked convoy was spotted, leaving Downing Street under heavy escort. Some claimed Starmer was inside, being transported to a private location under police protection. Others whispered he was en route to Buckingham Palace for one final meeting with the King, a conversation that could determine the future of the Labour Party and perhaps Britain's entire political order. By sunrise, Britain awoke to a nation without a Prime Minister. Starmer was gone, and no one knew where he was. The country stood suspended between disbelief and unrest. Outside Westminster, the air was cold and electric, the smell of smoke still lingering from the night's protests. The gates of Downing Street were locked, guarded by armed officers with unreadable expressions. Inside, empty corridors echoed with the remnants of power: half-drunk cups of tea, piles of unsigned documents, and the ghost of authority that had vanished overnight. The machinery of government had stopped, and the heart of Britain was beating irregularly. The King remained silent. Buckingham Palace refused to confirm or deny whether Starmer had been summoned for a private audience. But palace insiders spoke of a tense night behind closed doors. Phone calls with senior judges, handwritten notes exchanged between courtiers and ministers, and one solemn declaration from the monarch: Britain must endure. No one knew what he meant. Some believed it was a call for calm. Others feared it was a warning that the chaos was only the beginning of something much larger. Meanwhile, the country continued to fracture. Markets plunged again as investors fled uncertainty. The pound hit a 5-year low, prompting emergency meetings across Europe and Washington. Foreign governments watched with alarm. France's president spoke openly of instability in a once reliable partner. The White House remained cautious, but behind the scenes, American officials expressed concern that Britain's leadership vacuum could create geopolitical ripples far beyond its shores. The once proud image of the United Kingdom, disciplined, democratic, unshakable, now appeared broken and confused before the world. Inside Parliament, the scramble for power began. Rachel Reeves made her first appearance since the ruling, her tone sharp, though her expression calm, as she called for stability, order, and responsible leadership, thinly veiling her ambitions behind appeals for unity. David Lammy positioned himself as a voice of reason, urging cooperation while quietly rallying allies. Yet the Labour Party was imploding factions formed by the hour. Leaks, accusations, and backroom deals dominated headlines. What remained of Starmer's government turned on itself like a wounded animal. On the opposite side, Reform UK and the Conservatives demanded a general election, calling Labour's leadership void a constitutional emergency. Nigel Farage appeared outside Parliament, surrounded by reporters, his voice ringing with defiance. The people deserve their voice back, not judges, not palace whispers, not unelected elites. The British people decide who governs. The crowd roared. For a moment, Farage was not just a politician. He was a symbol of rebellion against an establishment seemingly devouring itself from within. But the most shocking twist arrived hours later, when an unverified video began circulating online. It appeared to show Starmer inside Windsor Castle, standing before King Charles in a tense private exchange. The footage was grainy, filmed from a distant window, but the confrontation was unmistakable. Some said Starmer was pleading his case. Others claimed he was demanding to know who orchestrated his downfall. Moments later, the king turned away and motioned for guards. Whether real or fabricated, the video ignited a firestorm. The hashtag #The King's Decision began trending across every platform, gathering millions of views. Within minutes, Britain was divided yet again, between those who saw the king as the protector of the constitution and those who saw him as the quiet architect of Starmer's destruction. By evening, London streets had become a battlefield of belief. Protesters carrying Union Jack flags clashed with others, waving red banners in defiance. Chants of "Long live the Crown" collided with cries of "Democracy betrayed." Police struggled to contain the unrest as fires
Before
broke
the
out
election
near
and
Westminster
since.
Bridge. A city once known for the calm dignity of governance now resembled a nation at war with itself. The monarchy, the courts, and Parliament, three pillars of British order, had become symbols of division. In the chaos, one question dominated every newsroom and living room: who would lead Britain next? Some insiders whispered that the king was preparing to appoint an interim prime minister to restore Shum. The name heard most often was Lindsay Hoyle, the Speaker of the House, an ostensibly neutral figure with broad respect. But others insisted the monarchy would avoid direct involvement, fearing any move could ignite a full-scale constitutional crisis. The silence from Buckingham Palace grew deafening, each minute without a royal statement, deepening the uncertainty. As darkness fell again over London, the Supreme Court issued a final clarification. The ruling against Starmer was binding and irreversible. Those words ended any hope of appeal. Keir Starmer's political career was effectively over. But for millions of Britons, the true question was no longer about him. It was about the system itself. Could the Crown, the courts, and Parliament coexist after what had happened? Or had Britain's centuries-old balance of power finally shattered beyond repair? In pubs and on television panels, voices grew more desperate. Some warned that Starmer's fall was only the first domino, that more resignations, arrests, and revelations were coming. Others feared something darker, that this was the slow birth of a new kind of rule, where unelected forces decided who could and could not govern. The moral line between justice and power had blurred, and no one knew who was truly in control. As the night drew to a close, one image spread across the news: Buckingham Palace illuminated against the dark sky, its flag fluttering in the cold wind. Below it, people shouted, argued, and demanded answers, but none came. In the silence, a single thought haunted the nation. If the Supreme Court could bring down the Prime Minister, could it one day bring down